In the spring of 1943, German U-boat captains entered the North Atlantic with a confidence that had defined them for years. The myth of the Wolf Pack still lingered in Berlin, and on paper, Admiral Donit's boats were the hunters of the Atlantic, not the hunted. Yet the message coming back from the front lines had changed. Reports written in tight, exhausted handwriting described not Allied battleships, nor cruisers, nor even the larger destroyers as the greatest danger. Instead, commanders repeatedly warned of something far smaller, far simpler, and, to the German naval mindset, far more humiliating: the British corvette. By early 1943, the fear aboard U-boats was no longer tied to the thunder of big guns or the silhouette of a heavy warship on the horizon. What terrified them was the sudden, grinding presence of a Flower-class corvette, a ship so small it scarcely registered as a threat in the early war years. But now, U-boat captains were calling them the persistent ones, the ones that never left, and, as one officer later described, the ships that always came back for a second run. This shift didn't happen overnight. It grew out of months of relentless convoy battles where corvettes proved something far more decisive than size: endurance, proximity, and a kind of operational stubbornness that large warships simply didn't possess. When a battleship arrived, it signaled power. When a destroyer swept past, it signaled danger. But when a corvette appeared over the swell, it signaled something worse. It meant the U-boat had been found, and the hunt would continue for hours, sometimes for an entire day without pause. This is what German commanders came to hate most deeply. The corvette didn't need speed or firepower to become lethal. Its power came from its role: remaining glued to the convoy, living in the same seas the U-boats depended on, and applying constant pressure without relief. Captains who once boasted of outmaneuvering destroyers now found themselves trapped under a slow-moving corvette, unable to shake it off. And with each new depth charge pattern, the psychological strain grew heavier than the explosives themselves. To understand why these small ships became such a dominant fear, why hardened U-boat captains came to dread a 16-knot escort more than a capital ship, we need to go back to the winter of 1941 to 1942, when the balance of the Atlantic still favored Germany. It was in those critical months that the seeds of the U-boat's decline were planted, long before anyone in Berlin was ready to admit the tide was turning. The winter of 1941 to 1942 marked the last period when U-boat commanders still believed the convoy escorts were predictable. The German Navy assessed British corvettes as little more than emergency stopgaps, hastily built, lightly armed, and too slow to pose a tactical threat. Many German officers openly mocked them in early reports, calling them coastal toys and poor man's escorts. What they didn't yet understand was that the strength of the corvette wasn't in speed or prestige, but in two far more important qualities: presence and proximity. During these months, convoys were still vulnerable, and the U-boats were inflicting heavy losses across the Atlantic. Yet the British were adapting. Every corvette added to a convoy wasn't simply another hull in the water. It was another ship that could remain with the convoy no matter the conditions. Destroyers might race off to chase contacts at high speed, but corvettes stayed where the U-boats needed to be, beside the merchant ships. And as German commanders pushed deeper into the North Atlantic, they discovered that these small escorts were learning faster than expected. By late 1941, British crews had endured nearly 2 years of continuous convoy warfare. Their seamanship, radar handling, ASTIC proficiency, and understanding of submarine behavior were sharpening with each crossing. German reports noted that corvettes were becoming more disciplined, more coordinated, and more determined. That determination mattered. When a destroyer made one aggressive run and broke off, the U-boat could reposition or dive deeper. But when a corvette found a contact, it stayed, adjusting its course, making slow, deliberate passes, forcing the submarine to respond again and again. The corvette's short hull, once dismissed by German officers as a weakness, turned out to be a tactical advantage. It allowed tight turning circles, letting the escort pivot quickly and reacquire ASTIC contact. And while U-boats could still dive to escape, every dive cost them battery power, air quality, and crew stamina. The Germans were beginning to realize that each encounter with a corvette came with escalating penalties. Not always explosive, but cumulative and draining. This was also the period when Allied intelligence and escort training began accelerating. Corvettes were no longer simply ships. They were instruments in a growing system that understood U-boats scientifically. German captains who once believed they could outsmart individual escorts were now facing crews who acted from doctrine, not guesswork. And as this system matured, the U-boat advantage that had defined 1940 and early 1941 began to erode. What looked like isolated improvements would soon converge into something far more dangerous, a type of escort pressure that no captain could easily escape. By early 1942, as German submarines surged into the Western Atlantic during Operation Paukenschlag, the drumbeat offensive, the contrast between theory and reality became painfully clear. U-boat commanders expected lightly defended convoys and inexperienced escorts. Instead, when they returned to the North Atlantic routes later in the year, they found that the British corvettes waiting for them were no longer the fragile, overstretched ships they once underestimated. The crews had endured some of the harshest conditions sailors could imagine, and with each month at sea they grew more confident, more methodical, and more unyielding. The Germans still saw them as slow. They still saw them as small. But they had begun to fear something far more consequential: the corvette's ability to stay locked onto a submarine for hours at a time. In war diaries and after-action reports, U-boat captains described these escorts as tenacious, unnaturally persistent, and immune to intimidation. That persistence was new, and it came from a combination of experience and emerging technology that large ships, surprisingly, didn't always exploit as effectively. Type 271 centimetric radar began appearing on British escorts, including corvettes, in late 1941 and early 1942. Unlike earlier radars, it could detect the exposed U-boat conning tower at remarkable ranges and in poor visibility. German submarines that once surfaced confidently at night to recharge now found themselves illuminated on enemy screens even in heavy seas. Captains complained that corvettes, which had previously been easy to avoid, were now appearing out of the fog with alarming accuracy. And this radar wasn't acting alone. HF/DF, known as Huff-Duff, began providing rapid bearings on U-boat radio transmissions. A single report to BDU headquarters could expose a submarine's general location. Corvettes used this data to adjust their search patterns and intercept points, turning the once chaotic mid-ocean battlespace into something more structured and more dangerous for the U-boats. German commanders realized that the British weren't reacting. They were anticipating. But perhaps the most important development of all was psychological, not technological. The corvettes lived in the same waters the U-boats depended on for success. They endured the same storms, the same freezing spray, the same rolling seas. And unlike destroyers, which often sprinted ahead or peeled away, corvettes remained tightly bound to the convoy screen. For U-boat captains, this meant every approach risked the immediate and suffocating presence of an escort that refused to break off. By the closing months of 1942, the difference was unmistakable. The U-boats could still strike hard at isolated moments, but the confidence that once defined the wolf packs was fading. German commanders were beginning to acknowledge, quietly at first, that they were now facing escorts that understood them far too well. And it was only the beginning of a deeper shift that would accelerate dramatically in early 1943, when corvettes, guided by refined doctrine and new tactics, became the most feared predators in the Atlantic. The turning of the tide began in early 1943, when British escort doctrine, shaped by years of trial, loss, and adaptation, reached full maturity. The shift didn't come from a single invention or a sudden strategic overhaul. It came from accumulated knowledge, distilled into a set of tactics that made corvettes far more lethal than German intelligence ever anticipated. By this time, U-boat commanders were no longer facing individual escorts acting on instinct. They were facing a coordinated system, refined under the guidance of the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, better known as WATU. WATU had spent the war quietly analyzing U-boat behavior. Using wargame tables in Liverpool, they identified patterns. How German captains turned after a missed depth charge run, where they were likely to dive after losing contact, how long they lingered at periscope depth before attempting escape. This knowledge was synthesized into precise, repeatable tactics. One of the most decisive was the creeping attack, which allowed escorts, including corvettes, to attack a submerged submarine without revealing their approach on ASTIC. In the creeping attack, One ship maintained distant contact on sonar while another, usually a corvette, approached silently at low speed. The U-boat, hearing only the distant pings of the first ship, often misjudged the threat and remained at a depth where it was most vulnerable. When the corvette was directly overhead, it executed a perfectly timed depth charge pattern, often catching the submarine completely unaware. German captains later admitted that creeping attacks were among the most terrifying experiences they faced. The usual cues of an impending attack, rapid screw noises or multiple ASTIC bearings, were absent. The explosion came without warning. Hedgehog, introduced to frontline escorts around the same time, further changed the dynamic. Corvettes equipped with the weapon no longer depended entirely on depth charges, which could lose contact during the attack run. Hedgehog allowed a corvette to fire a forward-throwing pattern of contact-fused bombs while still maintaining sonar lock. For the U-boat, it meant that remaining silent and deep was no longer a guarantee of survival. A single hit from a Hedgehog bomb was almost always fatal. Just as important was the emergence of escort support groups. These were not tied to a single convoy. Instead, they could be dispatched rapidly to reinforce convoys under attack. Some of the most effective groups, such as those led by Captain Frederick John Walker, relied heavily on the endurance and flexibility of corvettes. Walker himself favored coordinated, multi-ship hold-down tactics, in which corvettes maintained continuous contact with a submerged submarine for 10, 12, even 24 hours. The objective was simple: exhaust the U-boat until it was forced to surface, where it could be finished decisively. By this stage, U-boat captains were beginning to understand the chilling reality. A destroyer might attack fiercely and move on, but a corvette, backed by doctrine, radar, HF/DF, and relentless training, could pin them underwater until oxygen ran thin and batteries died. It was no longer a contest of strength. It was a contest of endurance. And the corvettes, slow, simple, often overlooked, were winning. By the spring of 1943, when the Battle of the Atlantic reached its decisive phase, the psychological burden on U-boat captains had become unmistakable. The vast Atlantic, once a hunting ground where German submarines stalked convoys at will, had transformed into a sea governed by escorts that no longer played by the old rules. And at the center of that transformation stood the British corvette, a ship so modest in appearance that many German officers initially refused to believe it could be the deadliest threat they would face. The reason was painfully simple. Corvettes denied U-boats the very conditions they needed to operate. Submarines depended on surfacing at night, recharging batteries, ventilating foul air, and communicating with headquarters. By 1943, corvettes equipped with radar and HF/DF, paired with improved search patterns, made those nighttime surface intervals increasingly dangerous. U-boat captains who once climbed the conning tower to scan the horizon at night now did so with dread, knowing that a corvette could detect them long before they spotted its silhouette. German reports described corvettes as ghosts in the dark, capable of appearing where no surface ship should reasonably be. Crews were startled when what looked like an empty horizon suddenly resolved into a radar-guided escort approaching steadily through the swell. The psychological impact was compounded by the escort's behavior. Corvettes did not break off. They did not sprint past. They circled, pressed, and stayed. Convoys themselves had also changed. Earlier in the war, a single corvette might be the only escort available, forced to defend dozens of merchant ships alone. By 1943, many mid-ocean groups were composed of multiple corvettes working in tight cooperation, often supplemented by frigates or destroyers. Their combined sonar screens overlapped, creating zones of continuous pressure where submarines struggled to reposition without being detected. For U-boat captains, it meant that every approach carried the risk of immediate and prolonged counterattack. When U-boats did manage to evade detection and launch a torpedo attack, their window of escape had narrowed. Corvettes, now trained to react instantly, turned toward the disturbance with disciplined precision. The familiar pattern repeated itself throughout the spring. A submarine fired, dove, and was immediately pursued. Hours passed, sometimes the entire night. The corvette remained overhead, dropping patterns of depth charges or Hedgehog bombs, forcing the U-boat deeper and draining its batteries. The submarine's crew grew exhausted long before the escort did. It was during these suffocating hold-downs that many German captains finally articulated what had become obvious. Battleships could destroy a submarine, but corvettes could break a crew. By May 1943, the month German historians later called Black May, the Wolfpack doctrine had collapsed. Losses were unsustainable, morale was crumbling, and the once confident U-boat arm was forced into retreat. And in countless after-action reports, the same conclusion appeared again and again. It was not the largest ships in the Royal Navy that made the Atlantic untenable. It was the small, unyielding corvettes that never gave the U-boats a moment to breathe. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the Battle of the Atlantic, make sure to subscribe for more deep-dive military history. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from.